Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Chairman, and it's a pleasure to take a call on this external sector that does cover a large number of agencies, as we've heard: Customs, Defence Force, Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Official Development Assistance. And Mr Chairman, I am going to cover largely in my speech the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade vote and what was covered at the estimates hearing there, and touch on some of the other votes, because, Mr Chairman, it was a very interesting estimates hearing, and I think that's covered off in the report that has been returned to this House on that hearing. That what we have is a minister that came before the committee who had a number of questions to answer in terms of foreign affairs. There was the $12 million that had been wasted on the demonstration farm, all supposedly to stop a legal threat that appears to have been non-existent. And this was something that certainly the committee looked on. We have that despite this, that minister said himself in Cabinet papers that the government needed to enter into the multi-million-dollar deal to avoid the legal threat. And, Mr Chairman, it really does open up questions about this most important of portfolios, because the minister does need to front up and provide evidence that he didn't mislead Cabinet, or otherwise there are some very serious questions that need to be asked. Another issue that was of concern to the committee, and certainly was at the fore of the hearings when the minister appeared, was the recent report that we've had from the Ombudsman around the inquiry into the diplomats Derek Leese and Nigel Fife, and whether or not those two men are now owed an apology. And this was something that was traversed in some depth at the hearing, Mr Chairman. While it was suggested by opposition members of the committee that this was certainly something that these two men were owed, the minister simply replied that he didn't want to open up old wounds. But one of the other key areas, of course, that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade are responsible for, and have a great deal of responsibility for, are climate change, Mr Chairman. That although some of the climate change portfolio falls under the environment portfolio that was talked about in the last theme that we were discussing, some of the issues around the ratification of the Paris Treaty fall squarely within the purview of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and certainly so do the issues around overseas aid in terms of climate finance and what goes particularly to our Pacific nations in that respect. So there are questions that have been asked. That we have a new minister that is trying to bring a new energy to the climate portfolio and to do more than her predecessor. But we do have the very real question, Mr Chairman, that the previous Minister of Climate Change said that whether or not the Paris Agreement would be ratified in New Zealand was highly conditional on a set of international obligations being met. And it is still, there is still some questions around what happens in terms of the conditionality of the target that New Zealand put on the table in Paris in terms of that ratification process of those international obligations, particularly around the international trading markets put in place. The other issue that was discussed more fully with the Minister at the estimates hearing was the issue of climate finance, because of course the Prime Minister within that financial year had come to the Paris conference and talked about an additional $200 million of climate aid to be put through the overseas development aid budget, and some of that of course is apportioned into this year's budget and appropriation, Mr Chairman. Some of that the Prime Minister came to Paris and talked about that funding, but it was good to have a chance to have a discussion with the Minister and to learn that a lot of this was actually just recycled aid money, that this wasn't new aid money that was coming in, it was money that was going through the Overseas Development Fund anyway. Not that I have any problem with us delivering a big portion of our climate finance through bilateral rather than multilateral means. I actually think it makes a great deal of sense, Mr Chairman. But one of the things that we did ask about at their estimates hearing was what checks and balances were going to be put in place to check that the money that is spent in this financial year as climate aid, in fact, is around mitigation and adaptation in terms of the Pacific, where that money is going, whether it really is genuinely climate finance or whether it's overseas development aid that's just wearing a different cloak, Mr. Chairman.
Dr.